I thought what I might do today is share with you all some stories of Medal of Honor recipients that you may be less familiar with. That, I think in this area we talk so often about those who have a connection to Tennessee. We talk about Andrews Raiders. We talk about Desmond Doss. We talk about Mr. Coolidge. We talk about Ray Duke from Whitwell and everything. And I thought, well, I'll go back and talk about some of the others that have absolutely fascinating stories. Some of them, the stories, the very last guy that I'm going to share with you is he is known among the Medal of Honor recipients as the Hercules of the Medal of Honor
Wow.
because his story is just almost unbelievable. Um, a little graphic, but I'm pretty good at cleaning things up for second and third graders since I've been spending a lot of time with them later. So, but we talk about our patriotic holidays, and of course, Fourth of July. Pretty much everybody celebrates Fourth of July because it's the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Some of you probably like me watch 1776 or watch Yankee Doodle Dandy.
Yeah.
In my dreams, James Cagney and I can dance. I can't dance at all, but in my dreams, I could dance with James Cagney. The 4th of July is just something that we've always celebrated as a nation. We celebrate Armed Forces Day. We did that just less than a month ago. And Armed Forces Day is the tribute to those who are currently serving in the military. Veterans Day, of course, began as Armistice Day, signifying the end of World War One. We commemorate that on November the 11th at 11/11 is usually when we start our programs because that's when the armistice was signed, ending World War One, and that's for those men and women who have served in the military. Memorial Day is the most, I think, for most people who work a lot with veterans, Memorial Day is the most emotional because it's the day set aside, and the media never gets this right. They drive me crazy. But Memorial Day is for those who have served in the armed forces but are no longer with us, that have gone on to their rest. And normally here in Chattanooga, we have that ceremony out at the Chattanooga National Cemetery, and we will do a very, very private ceremony there early on next Monday morning. But the cemetery cannot be opened to groups larger than 10 for any sort of formal program. So the leadership of the Chattanooga Area Veterans Council will go out, place wreaths at the Medal of Honor recipients, and then we will do several of the unknowns. The major ceremony in Chattanooga then will occur at 11 o'clock a.m. at the Tennessee National Guard Armory, named for Carl Levi, that's there on Holtzclaw Avenue. So, it's always an emotional ceremony because one of the things that we do is each of the veterans organizations that belongs to the Chattanooga Veterans Council, and that's all the American Legions, the VFWs, the VVAs, the prisoner of war group, all of those, we have a submarine bale that's owned by the Carbonera base. Alan Seiler, who is commander of that Carbonera, who's an old submariner, and each of the organizations stands up and we tell the number of their members that have died since last year, Memorial Day, and we toll the bell. So if VVA 203 has lost, I believe, 27 members this year, Vietnam era. Vietnam veterans dying at a much faster per capita. And so he has a little hammer and he hits the bell for each of those. So it's a very emotional service, and the families come because that's a way. It's sort of a closure for them and a recognition for them. So let's talk about Memorial Day, and I originally thought about, wouldn't it be good if we all talked about members of our family who are no longer with us, who served in the military, who have now gone on, and I'm sure all of us have people that we loved and still love that we will be missing on Memorial Day. But I decided that was probably too emotional. Some of us might, I for one might get too wrapped up in the story. So instead, Christine I have shared with her some slides of, I think I ended up with 6 Medal of Honor recipients whose stories I thought you might enjoy, just because I'm a firm believer that, and I said this yesterday to my kindergartners, first graders, and second graders up at Lookout Mountain Elementary. I do believe that each of us has a spark of divinity in us, and that if we train our character, if we train ourselves to be kind, to have integrity, to care about others, that then in moments of crisis, character shows, character counts. And each of these Medal of Honor recipients, there are only two of them that I ever met, but um, each Medal of Honor recipient that I've ever talked to has said, I was just doing my job. I just did what I was supposed to. So we're going to start with William Carney, who is always one of my Memorial Day postings. I don't know how many of you have seen, yay, have seen the movie Glory.
Yeah.
But William Carney is I put up I love the field of flags, and the Chattanooga National Cemetery will have flags for Memorial Day. We normally do that as a public event, but because of the limitation of numbers, the flags are going up this week in shifts. Boy Scouts and other volunteers are putting them up, but we just can't do it as a big event like we normally do. So, the flags are always a reminder of our fallen patriots. So the next slide is William Carney. And William Carney was the basis of the movie Glory. And for those of you that saw it, you'll remember that Denzel Washington plays the Carney inspired character, and Morgan Freeman plays his sergeant. Well, Carney's a fascinating guy. And I always love to talk about him. He is a soldier during the American Civil War. He obviously a Union soldier. He is a member of the United States Colored Troops. He grew up actually planning to be a minister. And when the Civil War broke out, he really was not particularly engaged in the concept. He was from Massachusetts, but when the Civil War broke out, and then in 1863, Robert Gould Shaw, who many of you may know was the founder of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, which is the famous African American unit. Shaw himself will also receive the Medal of Honor. Well, Carney had been born a slave in Virginia, and his father had escaped slavery and had gone north through the Underground Railroad. His father was then able to, one by one, purchase freedom for his family, for starting with the children, his wife last. So that by the time the Civil War began, all of the Carney family had been reunited in New Bedford outside of Boston. And William had learned to read and write, and had decided that he was going to be a minister. Well, in 1863, when the abolitionist William O. Douglas in The Liberator wrote about the 54th Massachusetts Regular Infantry, Carney said he felt the Lord speak to him, that as clearly as the Lord had led him to the ministry, he felt that the Lord was leading him to serve. And he said, and a quote from him, he said, I had a strong inclination to prepare myself for the ministry, but when the country called for all persons, I believed I could best serve my God by serving my country and my oppressed brothers. The sequel was short. I enlisted in the army. And he did do that. Now, if you have seen the movie, you will remember that he really struggled, though, with the fact that the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, Robert Gould Shaw, was white from a very wealthy, well-to-do family. And Carney struggled with the fact that here we are fighting for the abolition of slavery. In his mind, that's the primary purpose. And by 1863, that certainly has become what you're seeing in the northern newspapers in particular, but that they are still segregated in combat. So anyway, in July of 1863, the battle for Fort Wagner, the 54th, will go south towards South Carolina, and the battle at Fort Wagner will be a turning point actually in the American Civil War, because it will, after that battle is over, you'll have more people in the North, more people writing for the newspapers and everything, who they themselves had questioned whether or not Black soldiers were capable of fighting. Would they fight or would they not? The 54th Massachusetts answered that question. So Fort Sumner was on Morris Island, and it's in the harbor of Charleston. Shaw and about 600 of his men were ordered to spearhead the Federal assault, and they were to go onto the island using a really thin strip of sand. It was, for all intents and purposes, it was a death charge. Very similar to those of you that have studied the Civil War, and about the charge at St. Mary's Heights at the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is the Irish Brigade. I mean, it's just, they were straight up the hill into the guns. Here we have the narrow strip of land, and they are headed into the guns. So Carney is a part of that. They had burrowed themselves down into a sand dune, and from behind that sand dune, the charge came, and they go over the sand dune and they march forward in two wings of 5 companies each. And as they're marching forward, they are hit frontal with canisters, with shells, with musket fire, everything. The color sergeant, who is the person carrying the flag, was struck, and as he began to fall toward the ground, Carney, who up until that point had really been a bit of a malcontent because he just didn't feel like that this was the best use of their skills, Carney drops his gun and rushes forward and seizes the flag. And he charges forward, and in the process he makes it to the wall that they will go over to then gain access to the island. And he is standing alone on the wall, surrounded by the bodies of his dead and wounded comrades. He then looks around and realizes that the units that are to fall in behind the 54th have not begun their charge, because they're not certain the 54th is going to be able to do it. So Carney waves the flag, rallies the troops, charges forward, and he will, in the process of that charge, be struck 3 separate times. And each time he will stagger, but he maintains himself upright, because one of the things that the color sergeant, who had helped train Carney, one of the things he had told him was that the flag should never touch the ground. So Carney charges forward into the oncoming Confederate troops, and behind him come the men. And despite the fact that he's carrying slugs in his body, Carney keeps moving forward. After he had been shot the second time, then he's shot the third time. And then finally, he continues struggling on. He hears the New York troops coming behind. He realizes that the other troops are rallying. He is about to fall, and one of the members of the New York troops helps him, and they struggle on to the front. And when Carney finally collapses, it always makes me want to cry. When he collapses and they come to get him for the litter, the only question is, he says, "What about the flag?" And they say, "It never touched the ground." That becomes his rally cry in all future conflicts, is, "Boys, the grand old flag never touched the ground." Now, what's interesting about the Carney story is, Carney is the very first African American to receive the Medal of Honor, but he is not awarded the Medal of Honor until 1900, when Theodore Roosevelt asked that they go back and look at the records of men of color during the American Civil War. And Carney's story, there were so many eyewitness reports, there were so many eyewitness letters from white troops who marveled at this young man who is shot 3 times and still refuses to drop the flag and rallies all of the troops forward, that Carney becomes the first person to receive the Medal of Honor. So his is an absolutely fascinating story. If you have not seen Glory, Glory is a good one to see on Memorial Day, because it changes his life, but his action changes the lives of all of the African American soldiers who followed him in combat. Now, the next guy that I want to introduce you to, that you probably maybe have never met, is a guy by the name of William Pitsenbarger. And William Pitsenbarger received his Medal of Honor in 2000, which is 34 years after he was actually killed in combat. And his is one of those interesting stories also. Pitsenbarger had joined the U.S. Air Force, and you'll notice the Medals of Honor, while there are more in the U.S. Army, because the U.S. Army is larger in its numbers and historically always has been, there are Medal of Honor recipients in all branches of service. But Pitsenbarger had joined the U.S. Air Force in 1962, and he specialized in pararescue. He flew over 300 missions in Vietnam. And in his Medal of Honor citation, his commanding officer said of Pitsenbarger, every day that he was in Vietnam, he risked his life to save his fellow service members. April the 11th, 1966, he was part of an operation that involved two Huskies, two large helicopters, at that point, what we would today call Chinooks. And there were roughly half a dozen soldiers that had been knocked down near the Cambodian border. And Pitsenbarger flies in with them. He's part of pararescue, remember. He's lowered to the ground. He secures the wounded. The 6 soldiers are loaded up and they're flown to an air station. The crews return to evacuate the rest of the men who are trapped on the ground. Pitsenbarger had chosen to stay there with the 20 who were left because they were still coming under heavy fire, and he felt that it was his responsibility to take care of them. When the helicopters return, they start taking damage, and Pitsenbarger waves them off, tells them they cannot land to rescue the men that are trapped there. For the next 90 minutes, Pitsenbarger tends to the wounded. He made splints out of vines, stretchers out of little saplings. He policed the ammunition. He dispersed it to the active survivors. And then he took his rifle and joined them to fend off the Viet Cong who had surrounded them. Later that night, Pitsenbarger was taken out by an enemy sniper. His body was found still holding his rifle, still clutching his medic kit in the other hand. 9 other wounded soldiers survived because Pitsenbarger chose to stay behind and to take care of them. And for that, he was killed in action. His Medal of Honor was awarded in 2000 at the request of hundreds who had reviewed his records, but it had gone up through the process and it just took that long for him to finally be recognized. This is, in fact, the last photograph taken of him before his death in Vietnam. So, Pitsenbarger. The next person that you're going to meet is Paul R. Smith, and Paul R. Smith was a Medal of Honor recipient, is a Medal of Honor recipient in the war in Iraq. And Paul R. Smith, at the time of the invasion in 2003, he was a Sergeant First Class, B Company, Engineering Division, 3rd Infantry. And as part of the invasion, he was charged with leading a force that was ordered to block the highway between Baghdad and Saddam International Airport. You may remember that at the time when we were going into Iraq, the attempt by a lot of the high-ranking Iraqi officials to get out of the country via Saddam Hussein Airport, taking with them antiquities, money, all those sorts of things. Well, Smith was charged with blocking the highway. He used a wall that was near the highway that had a tower and he took up position there and used it to hold not only the captured Iraqis, but began to observe that 50 to 100 combatants were taking position in a trench nearby. They had a Bradley fighting vehicle. They had 3 APCs that were called to assault the trench, but they could not make contact. One of the APCs was struck by mortar fire. The Bradley had to leave early. What made the situation even more dire was the fact that the U.S. aid station was located near the enclosure where Smith's men were, and more than 100 wounded American soldiers were there. So Smith boarded one of the APCs, one of the M113s, and ordered the driver to get him as close as he could to the trench, where then he put himself in visible position where he could fire on the trench. And using 3 boxes of ammunition, he took out the enemy's tower, took out the majority of the enemy in that trench, and ultimately was killed after having saved those over 100 wounded soldiers and his own men. When his body was examined, he had been shot 13 times. And the driver who was with him said it took the 13th shot to take him down. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in 2005. His parents received it for him. Just absolutely an unbelievable story. Unbelievable, one man against an entire insurgents group in a trench, and he saved his men and saved those who were wounded. Tibor Reuben is, you're not supposed to have favorites among Medal of Honor recipients, but Tibor Reuben is one of my favorites. And I think part of what it is his story is absolutely fascinating. When you get a chance, you ought to read about him. He was 13 in 1943, living in Hungary when the Nazis took control and rounded all of the Jews up. And he and his family were sent to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, or he was sent to Mauthausen. The rest of his family was sent to Auschwitz. His father eventually was sent to Buchenwald. He had one sister who survived Auschwitz. His mother, his younger sister, nor his father survived. When the U.S. Army liberated Mauthausen in May of 1945, Tibor Reuben was barely alive. He weighed less than 80 pounds, but he made a pledge to the GIs who liberated the camp. And as they're carrying him to safety, always makes me want to cry too. He made a pledge that if he could ever immigrate to the United States, he was going to become a GI Joe just like they had been. He was nursed back to health. He was considered to be a displaced person until 1948, when he finally was granted the right to immigrate to the United States. Now, in 1948, he found a job as a butcher because his father had taught him how to work with meat and everything. He found himself a job as a butcher, but he learned English so that when the Korean War was declared in 1950, Tibor Reuben joined the 8th Cavalry Regiment and was sent to Korea. In Korea, he was a corporal, and he had, in a battle of intense fighting, he had been ordered to stay behind and to keep the men who were with him, to sort of safeguard their position, but he refused to do that. He stocked the empty the foxholes with grenades, and then when the North Koreans the next morning were charging, he began lobbing those grenades and firing his rifle and doing all sorts of things. And he single-handedly held that hill where he had stayed but had ordered the men behind him to fall back. He inflicted a huge number of casualties. Then he continued fighting, and in October of 1951, he, in a massive night assault, he is actually using machine gun. He is manning it for several hours. Their ammunition is exhausted. He has been wounded multiple times, and he's taken captive by the North Koreans. Now, all of the actions that he had done up until that point, according to his Medal of Honor citation, would have been worthy of the Medal of Honor. But what distinguishes Tibor Reuben from what tells you something about his indomitable spirit is he's taken to what was known among the North Koreans as the Death Valley camp. And then he was moved to camp number 5, which was even farther into North Korea. When they found out that he was from Hungary, which was at that point, you have to remember, under the Iron Curtain, under the control of the Soviets, they offered to release him and send him to Hungary. And he refused. He said he was no longer a Hungarian. He was a G.I. Joe. He was an American Yank. Wow. And he was proud of it. And he stayed with his men. And the Medal of Honor citation speaks to this, but they were cold. They didn't have food. They didn't have medicine. And Tibor Reuben, who was not trained as a medic, became the medic for that prisoner of war camp. And he would crawl from man to man. He would read imaginary letters to them from their families to keep their spirits up. When they didn't have medicine and soldiers were sick, he fed them pills, which he told them was a magic medicine that he had carried with him into combat, and it was going to keep them alive and keep them strong enough that they could survive and eventually be reunited with his family. They later found out the magic pills that he was feeding them were tiny pellets of goat poop. He was, is that not amazing? Absolutely amazing that he could maintain his composure. And he is credited with having saved over 50 men who were in that prisoner of war camp. Now, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and he was awarded the Silver Star twice for the actions prior to the prisoner of war. He came back to the United States, didn't think anything about his service or anything. He was just so happy to be an American. He said later he forgot all about the medals, didn't care about any of that. He got married, had a family. And in 1966, Congress passed a piece of legislation that asked the department, at that point, the Department of Defense, to examine the records of Jewish Americans who had fought during World War II and during Korea, because they recognized that there were no Medal of Honors for those who were Jewish. And Tibor Reuben's was one of 3 stories, one of 3 records that were brought forward. And you know, the number of letters that were written in support of him, he was alive to be awarded the Medal of Honor by George W. Bush in 2005. And he said, you know, the thing that always gets to me is when he talks, when he's awarded the medal by George W. Bush, you know, the president says, you know, how grateful they are, you know, what an amazing man he was, what a hero he was, and everything. And Tibor Reuben, you know, he said something to the effect of, you know, the Medal of Honor is the highest award and everything. And Tibor Reuben in the ceremony corrected him and said, "No, sir, Mr. President, I have to disagree with you. The highest honor I have is that I'm an American." And you know, I was very privileged to meet him not long before he died, and that's the story he told. He would go into classrooms and say, you know, life is what you choose to make of it. You know, I could have been angry that the Lord took my family away from me, that Yahweh took my family away from me, but I knew that it was not his work and that I had been left for a reason and there was a purpose to my life and I needed to find that. And I did. I have a family. I have children. The Reubens still remain. So absolutely fascinating story. You know, I think there are some videos on Google where you can um, see him talking. Just absolutely unbelievable man, unbelievable. And before I boohoo, we're going to move on to Ernest Childers, who was World War II, and Childers was a full-blooded Cree Indian, and he enlisted in World War II. And what you may not know, and I say this, only all of you may know this, but when I go into classrooms, I remind them that because of the citizenship of Indian nations, nations with sovereign nations within a sovereign nation, a part of those original treaties, if you are a member of one of the Indian nations, you're not drafted. You cannot be drafted. You can choose to serve. And certainly we know stories from Ira Hayes forward of incredible members of the military who also were members of Native American nations. But Ernest Childers, he says that he didn't see a lot of opportunity, a lot of jobs available for him as a young man um, at the end of the 1930s, and that when the United States got involved in World War II, he decided he would enlist in the military. And he is in Italy during that onset from Anzio up through the soft underbelly of Europe, and they are at Oliveto, and he actually told everyone that part of what set him up for the Medal of Honor is that they are charging. He falls into a shell crater, breaks a bone in his foot, and he makes his way back to the aid station. Well, by daylight of the next morning, he could see the enemy machine guns up on a ridge firing down on an old cemetery where many of the men in his unit, who were almost all Native American, were stationed, and they were, he said, being slaughtered. And there were students he had attended an Indian boarding school in Oklahoma, and there were students from all of the different Indian tribes there. And so many of the men who were serving alongside him, he knew from childhood from having gone to that Indian school. So this all Indian company had been created. He was their first sergeant. He had led them through North Africa. He had led them through Sicily, and he now was leading them up through Italy. And he said the anger that he felt because he had broken his foot and had gone back, he wraps his foot up. He collects 8 other GIs that are in the unit, and they move forward to save his men who are pinned down in that cemetery. And as they approach the cemetery, where the Germans are up on the ridge and they're hiding and everything, a pair of snipers jump up and they have their guns leveled at him, and he takes both of those snipers out. They then begin manning the machine gun emplacements, and they're spraying the wall around him. They're spraying where his men are. The men who later testified in his Medal of Honor said the bullets were hitting the ground in front of him and the dirt was flying up in his face, and Childers took single-handedly both of the machine gun nests out by himself. And to do so, they would jump up, fire, and then they would duck back down. Well, he picked up a baseball-sized rock, hurled it at them. They thought it was a grenade. They both jumped up, and he took both of the machine gunners out. From there, he continues on up a hill where the German mortars were firing down on his men. He was able to get the mortar gunner in his sights and took them out. And then he realized he was out of ammunition, at which point he stands up and orders them to surrender with such authority that they all threw their guns down, took their helmets off as a gesture of defeat, and the entire German company surrendered to Childers. saving his men who had been pinned down. Now, the other part of the story is his foot had been broken so badly that he had to be evacuated on a hospital ship. And the medics on the ship later said he drove them crazy. You know, his foot was disfigured, swollen from where he had broken so many bones by the time all of this is over. But he refused to allow them to send him home. He told them that if they tried to send him home, he would find his men and he would go back to them. So on April the 22nd of 1944, Ernest Childers was given a fresh uniform and was given a flight that would take him back to where his men were. And at that point, he was given command again. He did not realize what was happening. He landed, was given command of his men again, and then Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Devers stepped out and began reading from this document. And Childers, whose attention is on his brothers in arms, which he has not arms that he hasn't seen now in almost 4 months, suddenly realizes that something's going on. And when the general stepped forward to place the ribbon around his neck, was when he finally realized he had just been awarded the Medal of Honor. The story is he reaches down, picks it up, looks at it, and said, "What is this?" And the general said, "Son, that's the Medal of Honor." And he said, "Oh, well, that's good," and walked off to rejoin his men. It was not until, of course, much later that he realized the significance of the medal that he had been given. He comes back to the States, becomes actively involved in local government and community service, becomes a chief within his clan, and just it was an absolutely fascinating, amazing recipient, and one of the few who received the award and had never heard of it and didn't know what it was. He really just wanted that general to get out of his way so he could get back and see his guys. And the final guy that I wanted you all to meet is a guy by the name of David B. Bleak, which doesn't sound like, you know, you think Bleak. David Bleak is absolutely unbelievable. He grows up. He's going to be serving during Korea also. He's born in 1932. He's growing up in the Midwest, and he said he just didn't see a way to make a living. He was, in his words, in his autobiography, he says, "I was shaking the trees, trying to figure out what I was good at, wasn't sure that I was good at anything." And he decided he would join the Army. So he heads off in 1949 to the U.S. Army recruiter, and he says, "You know, I'm David B. Bleak. I'm here to join the Army." And the recruiting sergeant said, "Well, son, we're not really looking for soldiers right now. You know, why don't you go back home and find yourself a job? And if we ever need you, we'll let you know." Well, when war broke out in Korea in June of 1950, that recruiting sergeant remembered David Bleak and actually sent a message to him. Bleak came in and Bleak said, "You know, I want to be artillery. I want to drive a tank," because he had seen heavy equipment in the West because of the oil wells and all of that. And the recruiting sergeant said, "You look to me like a medical man." And Bleak later said, "I realized I suddenly had been reassigned and that I had no say in any of that." So Bleak goes off to training and shortly thereafter finds himself in Korea. And, you know, Korea, unless you grew up watching MASH, I think most people forget how inhospitable Korea was and how difficult the climate was, how cold it was. The infantry unit that he's involved in is up near the border, and his unit is pinned down by enemy fire also. Bleak volunteers to lead a group of men forward to take the enemy out. and he has this reconnaissance patrol. They're going to find out where the enemy is, and then they're going to try and take them out. Some of the men are going to be sent back to let everyone else know where the enemy is stationed. So they very quietly try to advance up this hill in, the dead of winter. And they almost literally fall into where they find a number of North Korean soldiers in a trench. And they discover the North Korean soldiers at about the same time that the North Korean soldiers see them, and the North Koreans open fire. Several of the Americans are wounded, and Bleak begins to care for those who have been wounded. While he's doing that, there is a frontal charge of North Korean soldiers, and the part of the trench where he is in with 5 or 6 wounded men he's taking care of, 2 North Korean soldiers jump into the trench with their bayonets and their guns, and David Bleak takes them out using his bare hands, no weapons. A third soldier jumps into the trench, and Bleak takes him out with his knife that's on his belt, and returns to treating the wounded soldiers. He sees a Chinese concussion grenade land on the ground down the trench, and he throws his body on top of what now are 4 wounded soldiers in the trench with 4 wounded American soldiers. He puts his body on top of them and takes all the shrapnel in his back, continues to treat the wounded, and will, within the next 2 hours, be shot in the leg during the heavy fighting that ensues. As the patrol begins to withdraw and take with them their wounded, Bleak grabs an injured American soldier and begins to carry him down the hill to safety. While he's limping down the hill, 2 more Chinese soldiers come at him with fixed bayonets. He drops the soldier he's carrying. He grabs hold of both men, and he takes them out by smashing their heads together. And then he picks his wounded soldier back up and carries him to safety. By the time he gets that last wounded man back down the hill, Bleak has been wounded multiple times himself and will be shipped out in early 1953 to a hospital in Japan. And while he's there, he will receive word that he is to receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. In that Medal of Honor citation, he is referred to as the Hercules of the Korean War, because most of his action involved using his bare hands and using no weapons. On November the 2nd, 1953, he gets to the White House, and President Dwight Eisenhower goes to put the Medal of Honor around his neck, and it won't fit. Eisenhower whispers to Bleak, and it is captured by the media, "Boy, you've got one damn big neck, just like Hercules." Bleak returns to the Midwest. He raises 4 children on a small family farm, and he will later go to work at the national laboratories and using what he had learned in the military to help develop electricity from nuclear energy. He just was a mountain of a man, just unbelievably large, unbelievably determined, and unbelievably loyal to the men he was to take care of. So David Bleak is our last one. Look at that, and it's 5:20. I was having to look at the clock. You think about, and these are all Medal of Honor recipients, and I want to be sure the Medal of Honor recipients would want me to say to you that very few of them did anything that there aren't thousands of other men out there who did. That they simply did what they needed to do to take care of their men, that very seldom did it involve themselves. From Tibor Reuben feeding them goat poop to keeping their morale up and, singing to them and doing whatever he had to do to keep those prisoners of war from giving up, having survived the Holocaust and choosing to do that, to David Bleak, who simply, because he's carrying a medic kit and doesn't have a gun handy, uses his hands to take out almost a dozen total members of the enemy forces. It's hard for us to imagine doing that, and yet I have had Medal of Honor recipients say, you do whatever you have to do to take care of your family and the men or women with whom they have served, from the first one that we talked about with William Carney, from the American Civil War up through the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, when you have even more diversity in the troops, that the people that you are alongside every day become your family. And there's not anything that you wouldn't do to take care of each other, because the guy on your right and the guy on your left are willing to do the same thing for you. So I think when we look at Memorial Day, that what I'm reminded so often is, all of these are Medal of Honor recipients who are no longer with us. And Memorial Day helps remind us that it's not only for those who were killed in combat, but it's for those who came home with wounds, and wounds that often are seen, but wounds that often are not seen. It's hard for me, as someone who has never served in the military, to understand what it would be like for someone like a David Bleak to come home and simply become a small farmer, raising corn, raising cattle, and raising 4 children with his wife, having seen what he saw during the war. For those who, whether you're talking American Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the more modern wars from the Persian Gulf to Iraq and to Afghanistan, the wounds are not always so visible to us. And on Monday, whatever we do with our families, and I have so often talk to folks about it. And I think one of the things that most of those who have served in the military would want for us to do is to use that time to celebrate family while commemorating the things that distinguish this nation. And, I'm unabashedly a flag waver. I'm one of those people that believes we have our faults and we have our flaws, but we are at least willing in most cases to acknowledge those and to work toward bettering this nation. And that's the true sign of patriotism. And Memorial Day is a wonderful day to remember those members of our own families, whether it's grandfathers, whether it's, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, brothers, husbands, whomever it is that we have loved and still love that's no longer with us, to remind ourselves and to remind our family members that we are very blessed, as Tibor Reuben said, to just be Americans, to just have a chance to get up each day and choose what we do with our lives. So Memorial Day, you never say Happy Memorial Day, because it's not a happy holiday, but you say, thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for serving. And for those of you who may be listening who have those near and dear members, or you yourself may have served, there's not adequate words to say thank you. And it's important that we remember the names of those who have gone on. If on Monday morning you've got your barbecue all planned and the grandkids are coming, or the kids are coming, or you're going, or whatever, and you have a chance, take 45 minutes and join us at the National Guard Armory. It's a relatively short ceremony, but it's a very meaningful ceremony. And there is something about For Whom the Bell Tolls, remembering those who are no longer with us, that have departed in the last year. So I'll be there. Wave at me, and we'll have we'll have a mini reunion in person. And if I don't see you on Memorial Day, fly your flag, say a thank you, drag out the family photos and share them with the family that you may be with. And if your family's not with you, it's a great time to Zoom or FaceTime or whatever you need to do so that you can be with them. We are very, very blessed that there are men and women of valor among us who are willing to step forward and to defend those ideas that we believe so much in. So, Christine?
Yes. Well, we're very blessed to have someone like you tell us these stories. And these are wonderful things to keep in mind on Memorial Day. And what a passionate way to like send off historical footsteps before we take a little break for the summer.
It is. And I do want to tell you all, as much as I know we're all getting ready to go on our summer breaks and we're going to be out there in the yard doing whatever we're doing, and we're going to be traveling and we're going to be spending time with family and everything, I'm going to truly miss all of you. And I hope you'll be back with us when we reconvene in August. I'm one of those old Southern girls that, friends become family, and I don't have a lot of family. So you guys are my family. And, it's kind of nice to have this circle of nerdy folks who all enjoy talking about history. And I'm going to miss all of you. But we'll be back in August if Christina doesn't fire me.
Not in a million years. Thank you so much. I didn't expect to cry today, but you got me tearing up. Those were beautiful stories.
They are beautiful stories. And, I sometimes look, Sammy Davis, for those of you that follow the Medal of Honor, Sammy Davis is the story Forrest Gump is based on Sammy Davis. In fact, if you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, there's that wonderful scene where Forrest goes to the White House and Lyndon Johnson puts the Medal of Honor. Well, that's actually Sammy Davis's medal ceremony, and they simply superimposed Tom Hanks's face on Sammy's body. And he was here in town last Thursday with his wife. We had dinner on Thursday night, and it was interesting. We were down at the Chattanooga where he was staying because he was going to be visiting classes. Well, there were a group of prom students, students who were going to a prom from Boyd Buchanan, a couple of other schools that were there in the restaurant also. And they kept staring at him. Well, he got up and went over and they said, "Are you somebody?" I love that. And he said, "Well, I'm Sammy Davis, and that's my wife, Dixie, and we're here in Chattanooga because we love Chattanooga and we have some good friends here." And one of the boys said, Is that the Medal of Honor?" And he said, "Yes, it is." And they asked a little, and he said, "Oh, I didn't do anything special. I was just taking care of my guys." And they stood around and talked. He took pictures with them for their prom. And when he came back over, and they all went on off to their prom, and he came back over and sat down with us. And I said, "Sammy, at some point they're going to realize who they were with tonight, and they will never forget meeting you." And his response was, "I never forget meeting the young people. I never forget meeting the kids. This is why we all serve." And I thought, that's the story in a nutshell. That's who they are, and that's why they do what they do. And they're just the most humble group of men around. And if you all were watching the news last week, we have a new Medal of Honor recipient. We had dropped to 65. We are now back up to 66. And his Medal of Honor was for service in Korea. He waited 70 years. Well, he said he didn't wait because he never expected to get the Medal of Honor. He had the Distinguished Cross, but it was upgraded 70 years later. So in his 90s, he received the Medal of Honor. And if you go read his citation, this sweet, gentle looking elderly man was a kick butt guy. Just unbelievable. But did what they all tend to do, and that's come back home, take the uniform off, become civilian citizens and just go back to being
family,
ordinary people. Isn't it wonderful that ordinary people have within them the ability to be extraordinary? And we see it every day in other ways, not in the military, but ordinary people who do extraordinary things in our community. That's our lesson from history, is that all of us have the potential to make a difference. You never know. You never know.